It all started with an old leather journal, the kind that smells of sun-dried paper and long-forgotten promises, tucked away beneath a pile of wool blankets in the cedar trunk at the foot of Eleanor Hayes's bed. A place untouched since her husband passed 13 years ago, and even then, only opened when memories grew too heavy to bear in silence. She hadn't meant to go rummaging that morning. July had arrived like a slow-burning fire in Sedona, spilling golden light across the terracotta cliffs and whispering stories through the open windows of her one-story adobe home. Max, her aging German shepherd, had been barking at nothing for hours, staring at the trunk like he could sense something hidden beneath the old quilts and lavender sachets. Maybe he could. The journal belonged to her grandfather, Jeremiah Lowry, a man both myth and memory in her family's line. An old cowboy-turned-cartographer who vanished without explanation in the spring of 1932 while searching for what he called the sunken soul of the desert, a city so ancient and quiet that time itself had seemingly chosen to forget it. Most of the family dismissed his tales as sunstroke and whiskey talk. But Eleanor, she always wondered. And now, sitting by the window with the journal in her lap and the copper light of the desert playing across its pages, she found herself wondering again. The entries were faded but legible, written in looping cursive, filled with strange references to the Whispering Stones, the Seven Markers, and a place he called Duskin Hollow, nestled somewhere between the Superstition Mountains and the dry belly of the Painted Desert. It sounded like fantasy, except for the map. A hand-drawn sketch on parchment tucked inside the journal's back flap, stained with sweat and time. Max sat at her feet, head resting on her worn slippers, eyes steady and waiting. And Eleanor felt it again, that faint, electric pull she hadn't felt in decades, the same one she felt at 24, standing in the ruins of Cahokia, mud on her boots and the wind of history in her lungs. Except now, it came not from curiosity, but necessity. Because time, like the desert, takes more than it gives. She packed slowly that evening. Not much, a canteen, notebooks, Jeremiah's journal, a rusting compass that hadn't spun straight since the Carter administration, and a photograph of her husband Thomas, still smiling in that flannel shirt he wore the day they drove through Monument Valley and fell in love again. She placed it gently into her coat pocket, right next to a folded letter from her daughter, unopened. As dusk settled in over Sedona and the orange cliffs turned crimson, Eleanor stepped outside, locked her front door, and glanced once more at the sky, not for answers, but for reassurance. Then she opened the truck door, and Max jumped in like he was 20 years younger. She didn't know what she expected to find out there, maybe nothing. But something in her bones, older than regret and sharper than memory, told her this journey wasn't about finding a city. It was about remembering why she'd stopped searching. And out in the distance, beyond the last streetlight and into the stretch of silence where the road disappeared into the waiting dark, a gust of wind carried the faintest scent of creosote, dust, and something ancient, like stone warmed by time, whispering her name. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the red earth as Eleanor guided her old truck along the forgotten backroads east of Camp Verde, where the pavement grew thin and the signs of civilization thinned to rusting fences and jackrabbits darting through sagebrush. She'd driven these roads before, back when Thomas was alive, and every weekend was a chance to chase memories in the high desert. But today felt different. Not nostalgic. Not even mournful. Just quiet. Like the land was holding its breath. Max sat upright in the passenger seat, ears perked and eyes focused, occasionally letting out a soft whine as if he, too, sensed something ancient in the wind, something neither of them could name. Eleanor placed a hand on his back, grounding herself, before reaching across the seat to open Jeremiah's journal once more. She flipped past the flowery introductions and family anecdotes until she reached a page labeled Marker 1, The Rock with Seven Eyes. According to the entry, it lay somewhere in the hills near Montezuma Well, a limestone sinkhole sacred to the Sinagua people, surrounded by ruins and legends older than European maps. Jeremiah had written, "If the desert wants to hide something, it hides it well. But even she leaves her secrets under the sun for those who remember how to see." It took Eleanor nearly 3 hours of searching dusty side roads and navigating barely their trails before she finally found it, not a literal rock with eyes, but a sandstone outcrop carved with 7 perfect indentations, each no bigger than a fist, positioned like a constellation. She ran her fingers over the grooves, smoothed by time, and felt a strange shiver run up her arm. Someone, or something, had meant these to be found, or followed. Jeremiah's notes described a pattern. Each marker pointed to the next, not in words, but in angles, shadows, and natural alignments, a map for the mind, not the eye. He called it, reading the desert like a clock that never tells the time. Eleanor took out a compass and held it beside the rock, watching where the afternoon sun fell. The longest shadow stretched northeast toward the distant cliffs of the Mogollon Rim. And beneath the note, Jeremiah had scrawled a single line in pencil, lighter than the rest. The second stone sings at dusk when the wind runs east. That evening, Eleanor and Max camped beside the marker, eating cold beans from a can while the sun dipped low and the cicadas sang their dry, rattling songs. She watched the rock through the amber glow of dusk, waiting, unsure of what she hoped to see. But just before the sun disappeared behind the hills, the wind shifted, a sudden, deliberate gust that carried a strange sound with it. Not a song, not quite a whisper, more like a sigh, deep and guttural, echoing off the canyon wall behind them. Max stood up fast, ears forward, and growled low. His fur bristled. Eleanor rose too, heart pounding, and turned toward the sound. And that's when she saw it, a narrow crevice in the canyon wall that hadn't been visible in the harsh daylight, now glowing faintly with the reflection of the dying sun, as if it had opened just for her. Inside the journal, beneath the drawing of the seven-eyed stone, there was a faint, almost invisible sketch of that same crevice, drawn in graphite, no annotations, just the shape. She hadn't noticed it before. Suddenly, Eleanor realized Jeremiah had made it here. He'd seen what she was seeing now. But the real question wasn't how far he got. It was why he never came back. The narrow crevice in the canyon wall was no more than a shoulder-wide crack veiled by tumbleweed and sunburnt rock, hidden in plain sight like a memory buried so deep it only resurfaced in twilight. Eleanor hesitated at the entrance, flashlight in one hand. Max pressed close to her leg, his muscles taut and trembling with a mix of alertness and uncertainty. The kind of animal knowing that speaks louder than words. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply, the dry heat of the desert giving way to a cool, mineral-scented silence. The walls closed around them, not in a threatening way, but with a kind of reverence, as if asking the intruders to tread softly in a place where time had forgotten to pass. As they walked, her flashlight flickered across ancient petroglyphs, spirals, human figures with outstretched arms, animals with elongated eyes. Some she recognized from textbooks and digs decades ago. Others she didn't, strange, symmetrical symbols etched too deliberately to be accidents, yet nowhere in the archaeological record. She paused, tracing one such symbol with her fingers, 3 concentric circles intersected by a vertical slash. It looked more mathematical than spiritual. Max barked sharply. She turned quickly and saw it. A cavity in the rock, low to the ground, like a sleeping alcove or a burial nook. And inside, wrapped in what looked like oiled canvas, was a bundle. Eleanor knelt carefully, hands trembling, and pulled it out into the light. The canvas crumbled slightly at the corners, but the bundle was intact. Inside, she found a small, leather-bound notebook, thinner than Jeremiah's, with a cracked spine and pages that smelled of earth and sweat. And on the first page, in the unmistakable hand of her grandfather, were the words, "For the one who hears the stones sing." She sat down slowly against the cave wall, stunned by the intimacy of it. This wasn't meant for the world. It was meant for someone who'd come looking, not for fame or answers, but for understanding. And now, nearly a century later, it had found her. The entries inside were brief but urgent, written in a faster, Messier version of his script. One page described a circle of bones arranged like a clock without numbers. Another warned of mirages that aren't mirages at all. But the last few pages, those were different. They became personal. I thought I came for discovery. But the desert showed me something else. Something older than names. I don't know if I'll make it back. But if you find this, it means you're closer than I ever was. The last marker is beneath the sleeping mesa. The one the locals call Devil's Rest. She closed the notebook and sat in silence for a long while, the only sound being Max's slow breathing and the occasional drip of water from the stone above. Her grandfather had been here, not just metaphorically, but physically. And more than that, he'd been afraid. As night crept in, Eleanor and Max left the crevice behind and set up camp just outside the canyon mouth. She lit a small fire and boiled water for tea, her hands steady now, her mind clearer than it had been in years. Somewhere out there, beyond the dry ridges and star-strewn plateaus, was Devil's Rest, a flat-topped mesa the color of dried blood, known in local lore as a place where travelers vanished without trace. She'd seen it once, years ago, from a distance, a strange geological formation that locals spoke of in hushed tones. Not haunted, exactly. Just avoided. Now, it was her next destination. As the fire crackled and coyotes howled in the distance, Eleanor looked at Max, whose head was resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. "We're not just chasing legends anymore," she whispered. "He left something behind, and it's waiting." In the distance, lightning flickered on the horizon, too far to hear, but close enough to feel in her bones. They reached Devil's Rest by mid-afternoon 2 days later, after winding through a maze of dry washes and unmarked trails that hadn't seen a tire tread in decades. The mesa rose like a sleeping beast out of the desert floor, flat, wide, and utterly still, casting a long shadow over the cracked earth. It didn't just look out of place. It felt out of time. Eleanor pulled the truck to a slow stop at the base of the formation, engine ticking softly in the heat. Max jumped down first, nose to the wind, body tense. There was no sound, not even whine, just the oppressive weight of silence pressing in like a memory too heavy to carry. She reached for Jeremiah's second notebook again, scanning the final passage. There's an opening beneath the west-facing cliff. Hard to see until late day. That's where the last stone sinks. It was almost sunset. They hiked up a narrow ravine that curled around the base like a spiral staircase carved by time and flash floods, Eleanor leaning on a walking stick she found near the truck, Max scouting a few yards ahead and then doubling back like a sentinel. The air grew cooler as the light dimmed, and the world took on that strange copper hue that only exists for 10 perfect minutes each evening, when everything ordinary becomes holy. And then they found it. A narrow, natural archway tucked beneath a jutting cliff face, barely high enough to crawl through, covered in lichen and dust. Impossible to see unless you were standing in the right place at the right time, just like he said. Inside, the space widened, not into a cave, exactly, but into a sheltered grotto carved by wind and water. The walls were smooth and warm to the touch, inscribed with hundreds of lines, spirals, and strange overlapping grits. And in the center of it all stood a single stone pedestal, waist-high, square, with a depression in the middle just wide enough to place a hand, or a book. Eleanor approached slowly, heart thudding. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the smaller of Jeremiah's 2 notebooks. It wasn't marked as such, but something about its shape, its weight, it felt like it belonged here. She set it in the center of the stone, and as the last beam of sunlight crept through the opening and touched the pedestal, the wind returned. Only it wasn't a gust. It was a vibration. Low, resonant, like the hum of a cello played beneath the ground, or the breathing of the earth itself. Max froze, ears stiff, staring directly at the stone. And Eleanor felt it, not in her ears but in her chest, like a voice not speaking, but remembering. And then, silence. Nothing moved. Not the light. Not the air. Even Max remained perfectly still, one paw lifted as if caught mid-step. Time, for that brief moment, had folded in on itself. Eleanor reached forward and opened the notebook to the final page. There was no text, only a simple drawing, a circle within a square, surrounded by dots. And beneath it, in faint pencil, just 2 words. Not alone. She stared at it for what felt like hours, until the sun had fully dipped behind the cliffs and the grotto returned to shadow. Then she packed the book away and sat down on the stone floor beside Max, who leaned gently against her side, eyes wide, but calm. The message was clear, not in logic, but in feeling. Jeremiah hadn't died lost. He had found something. Something deeply human, even if it couldn't be named. And in his final act, he had made sure it wouldn't disappear with him. He had left her not a destination, but a path. And now, sitting in the dark, Eleanor understood. This journey had never been about proving a legend. It had been about proving that something once mattered, deeply, truly, and that remembering it mattered still. Because the desert doesn't forget. It only waits. That night, sleep came in fragments, not the kind that rests the body, but the kind that stirs the spirit. Eleanor dreamed in symbols and sandstone, in voices that weren't voices but carried meaning nonetheless. She saw her grandfather as a young man, standing in that same grotto beneath Devil's Rest, hands weathered from sun and maps, eyes searching not for gold or glory, but for truth, the kind you can't put in a museum, the kind that only matters if someone remembers it with care. She woke before dawn, wrapped in a blanket, Max curled tightly at her side like a guardian of old legends. The desert was still, not silent, but listening. She took one last look at the stone pedestal and felt no need to question it anymore. It wasn't meant to be understood. It was meant to be felt. They descended slowly, following the same winding trail back down the mesa, but something had shifted. The air didn't feel so heavy, the silence no longer burdensome. The land hadn't changed, but she had. And when she reached the truck, something caught her eye. Tucked beneath the wiper blade was a small strip of paper, brittle, yellowed by time, like it had been waiting there for years and somehow chose this moment to reveal itself. There was no name, no date. Just 5 handwritten words in her grandfather's script. Don't follow the map. Listen. She smiled, tears stinging her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming grace of it. He had known. Maybe not exactly when or how, but he had known that someone would come. And he had trusted that she would understand what the others never could, that the treasure wasn't the destination, or the city, or even the secret itself. It was the connection, the lineage of wonder, the continuation of a question worth asking. Later that week, back in Sedona, Eleanor returned the journal to its place in the cedar chest, but not before copying every page, scanning every note, and tucking the printouts into a plain manila folder marked Lowry Expedition Personal Notes. She didn't need to publish it. She didn't want fame. But someday, her granddaughter might find it, and if the road ever called to her the way it had called to Eleanor, she'd have a place to start. Max was resting on the porch when the letter came, the one she'd left unopened for months. From her daughter, Amy. She sat in the porch swing, read it slowly, then folded it with a sigh of something between joy and regret. It was an invitation. To come live closer. To be needed again. And for the first time in years, Eleanor didn't feel like running. She felt ready. Not because she had finished something, but because she had honored it. She looked out across the red cliffs, bathed in golden morning light, and thought of Jeremiah. Of the stone that hummed. Of that single, powerful phrase. Not alone. And she understood. She wasn't chasing him anymore. She was walking beside him.